The first impressions on joining general practice in Ash, and my name is J.D.H. Cave. I was born on the 8th of November 1928 and qualified at Barts in May 52. I joined my cousin Dr. Mark Cave here as a GP on the 1st of September 1963. I had no experience of the area other than a brief visit to Ash whilst I'd been doing a locum in Faversham, and that was in 1956. I remember that on that occasion Mark took me on his rounds, and that School Road had yet to be joined to the Molland estate. And later in the afternoon I sat in a car under the shade of the chestnut tree outside Richborough Farm. But in 1963 the practice surgery was at number 41 The Street. The entrance was in Pudding Lane, and from that the waiting room offered seating for 6 on 2 facing old pub settles. Others who might need the doctor would stand or perhaps wait outside, and they might have to do that even if it was raining. Annie Court was our receptionist, and during the time of my predecessor, James Ogilvy, personal friends and private patients had been allowed to wait in the front room of Chiltern House, and they came in through a connecting door. The 2 consulting rooms were to the left and right of the door onto the street, and it was through that door that the patients left. I was surprised to find that the practice had got 2-way radio, quite an exceptional thing in those days. Because before my time, Mark had run the practice single-handed for 6 months, and during that time, in a widespread area, he'd found it of use, even though he had also the help of a locum, Richard Palmer. With handsets in each car and a base station at his home in Barnsole, a doctor out on a night call could be prevented from returning home, only to find that he had to go to another call in the same area. Unfortunately, the system left many areas uncovered, and being designed for use at sea and failing to give satisfaction to a taxi driver in Great Yarmouth before we had it, there were problems. It required 110 volts, and this could only be obtained through the use of a rotary converter fixed to the boot of my Morris 1000. Here it hummed quietly away, giving inquisitive children the belief that there were fairies. That idea had first to be planted. It drained the batteries so quickly that by doing 2 or 3 visits in Mon and Lee, I returned to the car to find the battery flat. Fortunately, the car had a starting handle, and so a single turn would start the engine, even with the flattest of batteries. I must admit to often turning the wireless off, but this concerned Alison Cave back at Chalk House Farm, who could not tell whether I was out of hearing or had just given the machine the boot. In the end, it was the base station that went up in smoke, and we fell back on the more reliable method of leaving a list where we could be contacted and the order in which our calls were to be done. And yet, there was one particular occasion when the wireless brought some kudos to the practice. A Harley Street physician came to Richborough for a domiciliary visit, but during the shepherding of the great man in his rolls out, the car had a puncture in Cooper Street, and Mark was able to take Sir Rodney Bodley Scott, physician to the Queen, to the patient, his car, and after the consultation returned to the rolls, the puncture having been mended by Alan Donaldson from the garage in the street. I recall only 2 occasions when we called a doctor down from London, Each would have been at a private expense to the patient, but calls upon local consultants were not uncommon, and these were on the National Health Service. Every weekday's surgery was held, no, that's better to put it, every surgery was held on a weekday at 8:30 in the morning, and then again at 6 o'clock in the evening, except for Tuesdays and Thursdays when there was only a morning surgery, as there was again on Saturday. We also had a surgery in the front room of Mr. and Mrs. Davidson's house at Preston. That was 2 o'clock, if I remember, on Wednesdays. And here we dispensed taking out medication from the Ash chemist. At that house we had a small stock of common drugs and Winchesters of cough medicine, indigestion remedies, and of course tonics. Of fundamental support, when I come to think of it, to the practice was the Ash Pharmacy, and to its owner, A.H.N. Robinson. I can remember the initials because it was over the door. He was known as Robbie, a lovely man. In that shop there was a wide selection of materials useful in the home and the farm, as well as medicines. And I can remember feeling particularly foolish when spotting raddles on a shelf and asking what they were. These were the days when one might write a prescription out in full, ending with the Fiat Mist and Mitty. Brompton Cocktail was also a great favourite for terminal cases, particularly when there was pain. They contained opiate, and also syrup Arantii and spiritus rectus. The latter, which is simply rectified spirit, of course, in Latin, was generally dished out as gin. And Robbie made up his own and some very popular cough medicines. At the end of morning surgery and after coffee, we shared calls between us, trying to ensure that each retained a patient that he'd been seeing, but always with an eye to avoid both doctors having to travel to the same outlying area. This was a time when the majority of patients did not possess a car, and so by visiting 20 or occasionally more, we would take all day, and could well mean we missed lunch and we might finish after evening surgery. When that happened, there would be a break in the tradition which had been present between James Ogilvy and Mark Cave of going to the Checkers for a drink after evening surgery. And they would meet the Twiddies across there. And I suspect that for some who didn't particularly wish to come to surgery, they could feel able to catch the doctor in the pub after the evening surgery was finished. It was increasing work that caused this tradition to end. Within a few weeks of my introduction to Ash, Mark needed to fly to New Zealand to see his son Graham. And so I became single-handed for about 6 weeks. It was in the October-November time, a quiet period for practice, and I was aware of the basic geography of the area we covered. From east to west it was Littlebourne to Sandwich Bay, and from north to south Nonnington to Stourmouth. And Mark left an excellent line drawing of the roads. And wherever possible, intersections were marked by pubs. And at a time when roads were not usually named, I think Drainless Drove was an exception, and houses might bear the number of the row rather than the street. For example, number 2 Richardson's Row. Pubs were like lighthouses could be to a mariner. The Palm Tree, the Prince of Wales, the First and Last, the Crooked Billet, the Rose. There was one in Westmarsh and another in Wickhambrew. All these were of enormous help in finding your way. At the Endeavour at Chatterling, A weekly visit was spent bandaging a varicose ulcer, and she was the landlady, and there she sat behind the bar serving beer whilst I was kneeling at her feet. Further afield we had the Dog and Duck, the Anchor, the Basket Maker's Arms, the Hood and Horse, and looking back I'm surprised that finding patients was so easy. And yet the great problem that I was terribly ignorant of individual peculiarities. And I began to feel that customers were perhaps not as satisfied as they ought to be with the replacement of their very able GP. And personally, I wasn't particularly happy with my work. One famous air ace from Sandwich Bay, who was used to entering the surgery through Chiltern House, he never came again. And another local farmer I lost was used to getting a National Health Service prescription for medication which he'd been given by a private consultation. Altogether, this was not a happy time. Even Pat felt she was known by all but knew no one, and when helping to set up a stall in the Garden of Memories, Miss Winifred Tarr had led her to think that she was not necessarily coming up to what was expected as a GP's wife. That November I was looking among the advertisements to find another practice. And yet I can recall that a birthday gift from Pat of a reel-to-reel tape recorder lifted the gloom, and there were some lovely funny moments recording the children. However, the aura of those first few months hung in the air for a very long time, and when it came to my first appointment as a senior partner, I overcorrected. My new partner was given less than an equal share of calls so that he might have time to get to know the patients. But yet the suggestion this was helpful backfired, and he left Ash feeling that there was not enough work for the three of us. When we first came, Spencer House was not ready, and my family lived with Mark and Alison Cave. Our intended home had been inhabited by Mrs. Burgess and a companion with her, and Mr. Barlow, an architect from Sandwich, helped by altering the ground floor. By so doing, he allowed Pat to get a good view of the garden from the kitchen. Spencer House had no central heating and a central hall with doors back and front, and the wind from the north entered uninvited. It was never warm in winter, despite paraffin heaters. But at this, we were not really alone. I mean, in those days, cottages were cold, and though there could be warmth from the cooker or a coal fire, council houses in modern Leigh had Rayburn cookers put in, but they were very rarely used. If you weren't well, you simply went to bed, and there you could keep warm. Outside the village there were little groups of cottages or single cottages, and most of these were tied to a farm with their labourers as tenants. Many tenants of council houses were working on the land, though a few had a training or had retired from farming. I had the impression that the possession of a council house was associated with a pride in its appearance and the garden that might be lacking if you were in a tied cottage. Most were well kept, though I recall one where there was a pile of dirty clothing at shoulder high up against the wall. And there was another where one's shoes would get sticky on the floor. It was perhaps because I had a young family that the majority of calls for children's illnesses evolved on me. These were the days of mumps, measles, whooping cough. Together with chest and ear infections, that was the common run of work. Measles came in 4-year cycles. An infected child with measles would be given 2 or 3 visits. Whooping cough was distressing and very worrying. There was no particularly effective treatment. In the elderly, the treatment of varicose veins could be very frustrating. When it was necessary for the Canterbury Hospital to take patients, acute surgical cases would go in without discussion. But it was very different from medical cases where there might be a chance that the patient could stay long. And admission of a patient with a stroke would be to a geriatric hospital. But if no bed was available, and this was not unusual, then the patient would be nursed at home by his or her relatives with the help of the district nurse. I think I should add that the district nurse expected to be treated as a nurse insofar as she would expect the patient to be in bed and the supervision to be from the GP. The area of each was defined parochially. Wingham had a district nurse and Ash had another. Ash Surgery also had the services of a health visitor, and she would visit new mothers on the 14th day because that was the day after confinement when the midwife, who was also the district nurse, would end her duty. The health visitor ran an infant welfare clinic once a month in the village hall, and here babies were weighed, given inoculations and vaccinations, and of course help given to the mothers. The village of those times was not entirely free of traffic, as heavy lorries used the narrow street, and I recall one went by every morning, sometime shortly after 5 o'clock. Parking was possible anywhere. Milk was delivered by horse and cart from Moss the milkman, and that horse's name was Silver. He knew, that's the horse that I'm talking about, precisely where his route was and where to stop, and he'd been known to slip into a fast trot on the way back to the stable, causing the empties to rattle alarmingly. 2 butchers, a grocer at Pound Corner and again at Provisions, a garage where the garage of number 45 the street now stands, and one obtained petrol from the pumps outside the Lion. There were smaller general stores at Gilton and at the end of Victoria Terrace. And so in 1963 it was a different world. Patients, I think, are now treated far better. We had little recourse to X-ray and only simple laboratory investigations. The GP did minor surgery and midwifery. The rule was that if you mistreated a patient, no one would matter, but you must never forget one. If you cared, you would be forgiven. The practice in Ash had a reputation of always responding to the request for a call.